Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Thursday, April 6, 2017. Donald Trump is ready to leap over the red line and step into a big military trap in Syria. And all of his pathologies come into play, starting with his impulsiveness, his bully personality, and his insecurities. He is so desperate to be liked. Well, as I sat down to record the podcast today, news broke from Washington that the Pentagon is preparing options for a military strike in response to the Syrian government's chemical weapons attack that killed dozens of civilians on Tuesday. Now, I read that verbatim from the New York Times, written by Michael Gordon, the guy who helped mislead us into the war in Iraq. And he used the language without any modifiers: the Syrian government's chemical weapons attack. We don't know that the Syrian government is responsible for that chemical weapons attack. It has been about 48 hours as I speak to you, and there are investigations underway. In a moment, I'll tell you about the autopsies that indicate that nerve agents were used. But Trump is leaping headlong into a trap that may have been set by rebels who said, last week Trump said Assad can stay. What can we do to change that? And by demonizing the Assad government, which is already as dark as it can get, it could trigger this kind of emotional response by Trump. So at the Pentagon, the top-level consultations include Mad Dog Mattis, the defense secretary, Joe Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, this is interesting because yesterday at the White House, Trump said, well, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do. But this appears to be the clue that a secret plan to expand U.S. attacks in Syria is being contemplated. And what really burns me is the sheer hypocrisy of this man. Yesterday in the joint news conference with King Abdullah of Jordan, he really rejected the polite language from the king about why the U.S. should be accepting refugees from Syria. After all, Jordan is on the verge of collapse because of the commitment it has made to accept refugees from the 6-year Syrian war. But Donald Trump, the man who will not even allow women and children who are refugees from the Syrian war into the United States because he's pandering to the deep-seated fears of his racist base, he stood up and said that watching the videos of those kids being killed changed his heart. We didn't know he had one. And it appears to be changing his policies. Nikki Haley over at the United Nations is making threats. And it appears that Trump will be sucked into carrying this out. And he continues to blame Obama for not attacking Syria when the so-called red line was crossed back in 2013. And he, at the time, posted numerous tweets counseling and demanding that Obama not attack Syria. Here's a tweet. President Obama, do not attack Syria. There is no upside and tremendous downside. Save your powder for another and more important day. But, of course, that doesn't matter now. It doesn't apply to a guy like Trump. He doesn't need to take his own advice. So, as I mentioned, over the border in Turkey, autopsies have been conducted on at least 3 of the victims of this attack. And the preliminary report is that patients were exposed to chemical material, and in parentheses, the word sarin is spelled out. Now, this could be an excerpt from a much longer report, who knows? But confirming that a nerve agent was used is not surprising. This gives us no evidence of who actually deployed such a nerve agent. And Turkey is a suspicious source of information to begin with. So let's turn to Bob Perry, a good friend of this program and yours truly, and the proprietor at consortiumnews.com. He opens with the latest hasty judgment about Tuesday's poison gas deaths in rebel-held areas of northern Syria. The mainstream U.S. media once more reveals itself to be a threat to responsible journalism and to the future of humanity. And I don't think that's understated, Bob. He continues, again, we see the troubling pattern of verdict first, investigation later, even when that behavior can lead to a dangerous war escalation and many more deaths, including of those beautiful babies that Trump was babbling about. And let me be fair here, okay? I care about babies too. But I haven't authorized drone attacks and aerial assaults that have killed women and children. Donald Trump has. In Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. We think in Somalia. And he's just getting started. Back to Perry. Before a careful evaluation of the evidence about Tuesday's tragedy was even possible, the New York Times and other major U.S. news outlets had pinned the blame on the government of Bashar al-Assad. And that revived demands that the U.S. and other nations establish a no-fly zone over Syria, which would amount to launching another regime change war and would put America in a likely hot war with nuclear-armed Russia. And as a good journalist, Bob Perry examines some other possibilities. It's possible that Syrian warplanes bombed a rebel weapons depot where the poison gas was stored. Another possibility was a staged event by increasingly desperate al-Qaeda jihadists who are known for their disregard for human life. Another source cited the possibility that Turkey had supplied the rebels with poison gas for potential use against Kurdish forces operating in northern Syria. And when Seymour Hersh and others looked into the August 21, 2013 sarin gas attacks outside Damascus, when we heard John Kerry repeatedly thunder that he knew who was responsible, well, subsequent investigations undermined the claims, and I won't detail it for you. You can read Bob Perry's story. And then he gives us the lowdown on Michael Gordon and his co-author of the Times stories about Syria, Ann Barnard. And again, I know enough about Mike Gordon that if you don't, you should read this article, and it will help you understand his past. And so Perry goes on to talk about the current reporting, where he says, perhaps for the first time, the New York Times cited President Trump as a reliable source because he and his press secretary were saying what the Times wanted to hear, that Assad must be guilty. Gordon and Barnard also cited the controversial White Helmets, the rebels' Western-financed civil defense group that has worked in close proximity with al-Qaeda's Nusra Front and has come under suspicion for staging heroic rescues, but is nevertheless treated as a fount of truth-telling by the mainstream U.S. media. And the New York Times report waits until paragraph 27 to note and then dismiss the denials from the Syrian and Russian governments. So this is a really strong piece. I encourage you to read it. I will link to it in the show file for this podcast, along with a great piece by Kevin Gosztola, who broadens the question to the entire U.S. media. How do media outlets know the source of chemical attack was the Syrian government? And at Shadowproof, he recites some of the same questions that Bob Perry has raised, and also cites some of the sources of the claims that the Syrian government is flatly responsible. And he undermines the credibility of many of those sources. Let's give you an example. CNN has quoted Anas al-Diab, an activist with the Aleppo Media Center, who told the outlet that an airstrike hit the town center and emitted a poisonous gas. But he didn't say that he witnessed the attack. And Gosztola notes that the same Aleppo Media Center was responsible for making that photograph of the boy in the ambulance that went viral in Western media. So these are skilled propagandists who know how to tug on the heartstrings of Americans, including the Trumpster. Gastola also comments on one of the other people that I talked about yesterday, Dr. Shahjul Islam, who posted videos of himself reporting on the incident. What no outlet reports is that Islam was accused of involvement in the kidnapping of British journalist John Cantil and photographer Jerwin Erlemans. The case against him collapsed when the prosecution was unable to call the witnesses. So these are people with questionable motives and murky pasts, and they appear to be the foundations of the reporting in the West that flatly says Syrian government is responsible. Oh, no, it's not a government, it's a regime. Yeah, got to get my demonization language right. And here at the Washington Post, they ridicule Congressman Tom Massey from Kentucky. The headline reads, "This GOP congressman still doesn't believe that Assad is behind the Syrian attack." I mean, it's dripping with sarcasm and judgment. And Tom Massey is a libertarian. I agree with him on some issues, like our Fourth Amendment. We'll get to an issue about that later. But I commend him for having the courage to be skeptical and speak up about it. The rest of them are falling into line like sheep, including most Democrats. And Massey told a reporter, "Frankly, I don't think Assad would have done that. It doesn't serve his interests. It would serve to draw us into that civil war even further. It's hard for me to understand why he would do that if he did." And a reporter was challenging him, and he said, "Do you have the facts?" Let me ask you this. Who benefits? Who benefits if chemical weapons were used and America weighs in on the side of the rebels or wades into a war against Assad? How does Assad benefit from that? When asked if he believed the latest attack would compel the U.S. to take a more active role, Massey demurred, noting that any potential involvement better come to a vote here in the House of Representatives. Well, nobody ever asked Obama to do that, and that's now kind of passé. So Rex on Tillerson, acting as Secretary of State, channeled John Kerry. "There's no doubt in our mind that the Syrian regime under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad is responsible for this horrific attack." But a congressman who questions that draws ridicule in the Beltway paper, the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And here's another critical voice from The Guardian, David Shariat Madari. Oh boy, that's a long name. Shariat Madari is my best attempt. And his headline reads, "Trump's change of heart on Syria isn't reassuring. It's profoundly disturbing." And he notes that there have been chemical attacks reported by the Assad government. Some of those I question, but it's true. There have been, even after he allegedly gave up his storehouse of chemical weapons. But this writer says no one quite knows whether Nikki Haley at the UN and the rest of them are speaking from a Trump-approved hymn sheet or concerned with protecting their own reputations. And he said no one quite knows what to make of Haley's statement. "Our priority," this was last week, "is no longer to sit there and focus on getting Assad out." Well, yesterday she was holding up pictures of dead babies and hammering Assad. So this pivot, in my view, appears to be a successful propaganda operation where Trump has been buffaloed into shifting his position. And I find this deeply frightening and terribly offensive. And once again, we see the American media and political leaders line up behind what is at best these unproven allegations. And the response is always more military action, more death and destruction delivered by the United States on Islamic soil in the Middle East that will haunt us for decades, if not centuries. Well, he finally did it. Devin Nunes is stepping aside. He's not stepping down, not recusing himself, not resigning from the House Intelligence Committee, but he is stepping aside to spend more time with his lawyers because this morning it was announced by the House Ethics Committee that they're investigating possible disclosure of classified materials by Devin Nunes. Now, as you know, I have no confidence in the Senate or House committees investigating these matters, and it's gotten worse because as Nunes steps aside, and he should have done it before now, he is handing off his baton to three dangerous people: Mike Conaway, Trey Gowdy, and Tom Rooney. The three of them will temporarily take charge of the committee's Russia investigation. But Trey Gowdy, who, sharpened his chops on the Benghazi crusade, and this guy Conaway, they're both deeply compromised already. We know that they are partisan hacks who are not going to be interested in an honest and untainted investigation. They want a political result. In a January interview, Conaway minimized the importance of Russian interference in the election, telling the Dallas Morning News that it's like a Mexican soap opera star influencing the vote in Nevada. Now, that's just a bizarre thing to say to begin with. But he's obviously trying to distract and minimize any culpability by Trump and his associates. Meanwhile, today I'm releasing an in-depth interview that I highly recommend to you. Russ Baker joined me by Skype to talk about the powerful investigation he and his team did at whowhatwhy.org. And they explain a theory on why the FBI can't tell all about Trump and Russia. And it's because of an investigation that goes back 30 years into Russian mobsters, many of whom have rented office or personal space at Trump Tower. And it focuses deeply on a guy named Felix Sater, who is a convicted felon who hung around with Trump and then appears to have become an employee or a partner of Trump's as he went around the world brokering deals to license the Trump name for hotels and resorts and other properties. It is a stunning report, and what's really remarkable is it doesn't use a single anonymous source or a leaked item. It's based on documents from a court case, and all of the sources in this piece are named. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Russ Baker, where he talks about some of the connections between Donald Trump and Felix Sater.
You have to remember that Donald Trump, despite his so-called vaunted skills at making money, he actually lost huge amounts of money. He had invested very, very heavily and dominated Atlantic City, and that proved disastrous.
A real bad bet, yeah.
And without going into too much detail there, he really was down. And around this period, we start seeing not just Bayrock and Felix Sater, but any number of different people from the former Soviet Union pumping money into deals and programs with the Trump organization. There's actually a quote in that article from Donald Trump Jr. where he's in the former Soviet Union, and he actually makes a public statement that money from the former Soviet Union is key, I believe, a majority of their monies. And then you've got this Sater and the people who partner into this thing. And Sater, as we understand it, and as he asserts, came up with the whole idea of this very fancy Hotel Trump Soho hotel and condominiums. It's a dominant building downtown today in New York, and that Sater came up with this idea of franchising the name all over the place, and that he would go and travel. And it's very interesting because they had bilked people of $40 to $60 million, and he faced potentially a very long jail sentence and a huge financial liability. But the FBI decided to basically let him off scot-free with a $25,000 slap on the wrist. And they themselves stated that he was tremendously helpful during this period. And they actually, despite the fact that he was a convicted criminal, they not just for that, but for something else, an incident some years earlier when he attacked and slashed a man with a margarita glass in a bar. And he had also been barred from, working in financial stuff. And so nevertheless, there he was with all these big deals. And so he is basically taking the Trump name on the road and selling it, essentially sort of licensing it.
Check out the full interview with Russ Baker. It's released today at peterbcollins.com and all of our major outlets. And I appreciate the support of subscribers who make it all possible. Devoted people like Abby McMillan, Natalie Reel, Anna Gordonier, and Mona Kobus. They're all subscribers to the Peter B. Collins podcast, and I encourage you to join them. I need your help. We have turnover in subscribers. It's a natural thing. Some people get angry because of something I say, and they take their money away, and I understand that. But if you find these podcasts valuable, I encourage you to start a subscription today. Go to peterbcollins.com, click on menu, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page, and in minutes, you're all set. Well, it wasn't really a surprise, but the drama in the ritual, which was heavily scripted in the United States Senate, played out today in what is called the nuclear option. After the refusal of Democrats to provide enough votes to end debate over the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch as Supreme Court Justice, the Democrats used every available parliamentary maneuver. And I don't like Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, senator from New York, but I have to say that he played a weak hand as well as he could. In the end, he even tried to adjourn the Senate until 5 p.m. today, which would ripple through and prevent a vote before the Easter recess. And he got a couple of Republicans, 2 of them, to join that effort, but it wasn't enough to stop the freight train with the nuclear bomb on it that Mitch McConnell rolled into the Senate this morning. And so everybody stood firm. All Democrats voted in unity, and all Republicans voted in unity. They blew up the cloture rule for Supreme Court nominees. And tomorrow, the Republican majority will handily confirm Neil Gorsuch, a movement conservative of the worst order, a guy who, in late-breaking disclosures, is accused of plagiarism in a book that he wrote. And if you look at the evidence, it's pretty clear that he liberally, for a conservative, he liberally borrowed from another author. And this is also despite the fact that while he was being grilled on Capitol Hill, his future colleagues, the other 8 members of the Supreme Court, unanimously overturned a ruling of Judge Gorsuch. It was a case regarding the setting of education standards for students with disabilities. And the court rebuked the ruling, saying that, the level of progress that Judge Gorsuch offered can hardly be said to have been offered an education at all. So it is amazing how partisanship has taken hold. And we are the victims, friends. That's how it's playing out. Meanwhile, lawsuits are being filed to challenge some of the really ugly moves by Scott Pruitt, the former Attorney General from Oklahoma who had sued the agency that he now leads 14 times. And over at the EPA, he reversed a position on a pesticide that the Obama administration had recommended banning, at least for use on crops. The chemical is called chlorpyrifos, a pesticide linked to brain damage in children. Oh, and that's not all. The report indicates that pregnant mothers who have had even low exposure to the pesticide can end up giving birth to children with long-term and potentially irreversible brain abnormalities. But hey, how important is that when you can fatten the bottom line at Dow Chemical and other producers, some of whom were there to cheer Donald Trump when he signed the order reversing the protections that were put in place by the Obama administration. Similarly, on the Clean Coal Plan, the Obama's Clean Power Plan, that would have required states to slash carbon dioxide emissions from power plants but was never implemented. Well, it has been repealed before implementation, and it is now the source of lawsuits brought by 17 attorneys general, and not all of them are from completely red states. I see that Maine is represented here. So this is going to be the process where lawsuits are the only available option for opponents of the really gruesome moves of this team, the wrecking crew in Washington. And the same Kevin Gostola I mentioned earlier from Shadowproof has an interesting piece about Scott Pruitt and the way he dodges questions, including from the Fox News boy Chris Wallace. Wallace asked Pruitt how the EPA would prevent terrible things like premature deaths from occurring without the Clean Power Plan. And Pruitt, on robot setting, said, well, what's important is to recognize the president's keeping his promise to the American people to roll back regulatory overreaches that have been occurring the last couple of years. But Wallace, who can be a tough questioner, said, you're giving me a regulatory answer, a political answer. You're not giving me a health answer. Meanwhile, some action in Washington that I can applaud. A bipartisan group of 4 members, 2 senators and 2 members of the House, have introduced legislation to enforce our Fourth Amendment rights at the U.S. border. When we cross a border or come in at an airport, we should not have to cough up the contents of a cell phone or a laptop without a court order and probable cause. That's what the Fourth Amendment says. And so Ron Wyden and Rand Paul in the Senate, Jared Polis of Colorado, and Blake Farenthold of Texas have joined forces to co-sponsor a bill essentially saying the Fourth Amendment applies and it cannot be abused just because you're at an airport or at a border crossing. I hope this gets a quick passage, but it's hard to imagine, given the proclivities of both Democrats and Republicans, that they will honor this because they can be brushed back with threats of terrorism. Yesterday, the TSA, on its website, appeared to announce that it's okay to carry pot either on board in your carry-on bag or in your checked luggage, you know what I mean. On the TSA website, on the page that's called What Can I Bring, that lists items allowed and banned for passengers, the medical marijuana section on Tuesday showed a bright green yes checked next to both checked baggage and carry-on bags. But somebody got a hold of that, and later the afternoon the page was blank for a while, and then it returned with both boxes checked no. Now, it does raise a bunch of interesting issues, because if I fly from San Francisco to L.A. in California, where both medical and adult use are now legal, can the TSA bust me? And likewise, if I'm flying from Colorado to Washington State, where it's legal on both ends, is there any basis for the TSA to take action? Well, TSA says that our officers are not looking for illegal narcotics, but they have to report them to law enforcement when discovered. And we're told that TSA defers to local law enforcement in matters of low-level drug possession. Well, we got a lot more work to do on all these issues, but that is an interesting story. And in Seattle, where the city council passed the first-in-the-nation law allowing drivers who work for Lyft and Uber to form unions, a federal judge, after a lawsuit brought by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, whose members include Uber and Lyft, has put a hold on that. Now, narrowly on the question of the law, there is a legal point here, and that is that Uber and Lyft drivers are not employees of their companies, they're independent contractors. And union collective bargaining assumes an employer-employee relationship. That's how all those laws are written. So something will have to change before we can see unionization of the people who work for Lyft and for Uber. And finally today, I want to welcome back Gary Chu, the official film reviewer of the Peter B. Collins podcast, who wants to tell us about a new feature film that he highly recommends called Zookeeper's Wife.
3 of the most powerful movies I've ever seen are Sophie's Choice, Schindler's List, and The Pianist. Together, they took a total of 11 Oscars and informed film fans too young to recall of the evil wrought by Hitler's Third Reich during World War II. I can remember some of the atrocities myself, but these 3 motion pictures, particularly and hopefully, will be indelibly filed forevermore in the minds of people born after the late 40s and early 50s. But just imagine, if you will, that you've never seen such a film about the Third Reich. And you walk into a theater, sit down, and watch this just-released picture called The Zookeeper's Wife, from New Zealand-born director Nicky Caro. You'll likely be blown away by her film. It's based on real events that began in Warsaw, Poland in 1939. Not so much of a very good year for Europe. Since Jessica Chastain is one of the producers of the film, I'd like to suggest Chastain has added her name to a remarkable roster of other actors for helping to sustain a vital cautionary narrative quite common to cinema. Among others, the list includes Meryl Streep, Liam Neeson, Sir Ben Kingsley, Ralph Fiennes, and Adrian Brody. Chastain in the title role plays Antonina Zabinski, a zookeeper's wife and significant woman of history. The screenplay comes from a book by Diane Ackerman, who relied on journals and other writings of Mrs. Zabinski. Antonina was also a teacher and author of books for children about animals. Her husband, Jan, played by Flemish actor Johan Heldenberg, was a zoologist and scientist. Jan founded the Warsaw Zoo, and together the Zabrinskis operated it with the help of dedicated employees. Germany invades Poland in September of 1939, occupying the nation. Actor Michael Brühl plays the role of a German zoologist named Lutz Heck. He had met the Zabrinskis at zoological conferences in Europe prior to Hitler's push into Poland. As the Warsaw occupation continues, Heck arrives at the zoo as a sort of nice guy Nazi, having much already in common with Antonina and Jan. To some extent, Heck protects the pair because of their similar interests and the knowledge they share about animals, but Heck also has a strong but quietly held physical attraction for Antonina. The Zookeeper's Wife then takes a similar path trod by Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. The Zabinskis, with the assistance of zoo employees, take on the risky challenge of smuggling Jews out of Warsaw, using trappings of the zoo and Jan's access to those being detained in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's quite amazing and pleasingly surreptitious to see the Zabinskis pulling the wool, so to speak, over the eyes of the German military. History indicates the Zabinskis saved about 300 Jews from going to Nazi concentration camps. Animal lovers certainly will be taken with the regular appearance of the beautiful creatures inhabiting the zoo's campus, as well as Antonina and Jan's home. Their love for the beasts is touching, especially when contrasted against the hostility of Hitler's stranglehold on the Polish people. I recommend this PG-13 movie for youngsters, but not the really young ones. There is violence of war and brief scenes of Heck's erotic intentions for Antonina. There's another instance of a similar attitude against a teenage girl fueled by the brutal lust of German foot soldiers. However, the warmth and kindness shown for people and animals in the film is a soothing balm for the uglier moments that could prove to be an important learning experience for kids. Prompted by our contemporary social discord, The Zookeeper's Wife will likely find validation in the regimen of the movie-going public. For the Peter B. Collins Podcast, I'm Gary Chu in Sacramento.
Thank you, Gary Chu. I think I'll take your advice and check out Zookeeper's Wife. Thanks for listening. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling